So I'd invite you to check out what our seniors have done this year. This link will get you to their research symposium. Since they weren't able to do it in person, it is there virtually, and you can go see their projects and the way people engage with them remotely. I mentioned that the work we're going to do is the work I'm going to mention or talk about today is fresh. Here's a screenshot of the paper from June of 2020. So it is indeed very, very fresh. In terms of what we're going to talk about today, talk a little bit about what is climate change anxiety, what influences it, and then our paper, what it is the first scientific study to measure it as a mental health phenomenon in humans. What I first want to start with is I want to talk a little bit about what's called in the psychological world as functional impairment. And this idea really started resonating with me about 15 years ago when I heard an expert in ADHD, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. His name is Dr. William Pelham, Bill Pelham. This is a paraphrase. It was a talk I heard him say, so I don't know the exact words, but here's the paraphrase, that most families don't seek treatment because their children have symptoms of ADHD. He said they seek treatment because those symptoms are causing impairment. That is, their lives are different because of those symptoms. There are some people who have symptoms of ADHD without the impairment in their life. Those people rarely seek treatment. It's the functional impairment. And what functional impairment is your life is different because of those symptoms. You're not doing as well in school as you would if those symptoms weren't there. Your social relationships are impacted. Your work life is less productive because of those symptoms. And so the symptoms exist. And for some people, that impacts the degree to which they are able to engage with the world. And I also want to be clear about something. I'm going to illustrate this outside of humans and with chemicals based on Melissa Schultz's research and a project that I had the privilege of doing with her. But one of the key points I want to make is that there are external influences on impairment. In other words, just because someone is experiencing functional impairment of any type of symptoms, whether it be depression, anxiety, or symptoms of ADHD, it does not mean it's that person's fault. There are also external influences on how people function. And so what this illustration is here is an illustration from that I obtained from Melissa Schultz and her work, where she studied antidepressant medication and its presence in the environment. And this picture here shows that the most common ways in which antidepressive medication, Zoloft, Prozac, gets into the environment is through improper waste disposal. So people will take unused medications and flush them down the toilet. There was a while that was actually recommended. Now it's, because that actually ends up in our water systems, now there's safe drop-off places. And believe it or not, the other primary route is through a natural biological process with these chemicals, which is human excretion. So it's not all, when someone takes medication, it's not all absorbed into the body. And so it goes into the sewer systems, and then the wastewater treatment plant, there's effluent into streams and rivers. So wastewater treatment plants do not treat for antidepressant chemicals. And so research has actually shown, and in fact, Melissa Schultz's research here at the College of Wooster has shown that biological organisms, including shrimp, have an uptake of these chemicals, as well as freshwater shrimp. And in fact, the animals do not behave the same when that chemical's in their body. And that should make perfect sense, because humans take these chemicals to change our behavior. Naturally, they're going to have an effect on other living organisms. So what Melissa Schultz's research showed was that fish engage in, their aggressive responses are altered. They're calmer. When faced with a threat, they do not respond as aggressively. Now that, in a fish, is functional impairment. Its life is different because it is now it is expressing some symptoms, in this case of a chemical that is in its body for an unintended reason. The picture of the shrimp there was actually a study that showed freshwater shrimp, when they are in an environment that has antidepressant medication in it, they approach light, which is the opposite of what a freshwater shrimp is supposed to be doing. They're actually supposed to avoid light because they are more likely to be consumed by a predator when they approach light. So again, that is functional impairment due to an external influence. And so far, you might be thinking, I thought you were going to talk about climate change. Well, so far, what I wanted to communicate to you is this notion of impairment, that our regular actions or our intended actions, what we want to do, becomes altered. And this gets replaced with a maladaptive behavior that results in a negative outcome. And so this is a very common process for a variety of mental health concerns and disorders. What I want to communicate to you is that that is the hallmark of a psychological disorder. If the impairment is not there, it is by definition not a disorder. Things are still in order. It's when that impairment comes, when someone's life is different, usually in a negative way, that is impairment. And the second point I want to make sure you're aware of is that that is not always the individual's fault. In fact, I would argue more often than not, it can be attributed to some external force. And I try to illustrate that with an environmental example of human actions impacting or causing functional impairment in the environment. And so that brings us to this most recent project I had the absolute privilege of working with Professor Susan Clayton on climate change anxiety. So Susan Clayton, who's a professor here at the College of Wooster, she is a global expert in climate change, in particular psychological aspects of it, both in terms of what are human behaviors that contribute to climate change, and then how are humans impacted by climate change. Now, this notion of climate change anxiety sort of took off in the public press. It kind of got a lot of attention before there was any scientific research, rigorous research done on it. So these are some screenshots of news articles one's from the New York Times, one's from Time Magazine. Eco-anxiety was listed as one of the words of the year, even though that is not, prior to that, it hadn't been well validated as a scientific term, but public press got ahead of it. And so what Susan and I wanted to do, I'm really grateful she approached me and wanted to collaborate. We wanted to think about, all right, well, what is the science behind this? And let's actually develop some of that scientific body of literature. And so what Susan and I were able to do, we surveyed thousands of people with measures on what would climate anxiety look like. So we studied measures of anxiety that already exist, and we adapted them to climate change. And some things that we learned through those surveys, and then a sophisticated statistical analyses of them. I'm going to spare you that. I'm happy to send you the article or talk about that in another context. But the key take-homes is that behavioral engagement related to climate change, in other words, what the average person does in response to it, turning off the lights, recycling, that did not correlate at all. That was not functional impairment. So there is an adaptive way to respond to climate change. We can be pro-environment. We can work to protect and save the earth in a healthy way that does not interfere with our lives, which just as an aside, that's actually an interesting kind of juxtaposition there. Some would argue our lives must be impacted in order for the earth to return to a state of well-being. But in terms of mental functioning, behavioral engagement in climate change efforts is not functional impairment, and we have data to support that. However, what did emerge in our study was that there was a subpopulation around 20% of our sample was indicating what we would call functional impairment. And so what was that? What does that look like? Let's think back to Dr. Pelham. It's when the maladaptive replaces the adaptive. So someone's anxiety or concern about the environment, these next 3 bullets that are here, these are actual words on the survey that humans are indicating is present with them. So interfering with my ability to get work or school assignments done. Now think about that. If I were talking with you about ADHD and I said there are some humans with symptoms of ADHD who have an inability to get schoolwork done or their work assignments done, you probably wouldn't be surprised that that's what ADHD is. And our studies here is one of the first to show not symptoms of ADHD, not symptoms of a known anxiety disorder or depression, but people's concern about the environment for some people is so significant that they're not able to focus at work. You can see it's hard for me to have fun with my families and friends. People are indicating that their social relationships are interfered because of their fixation on climate change. And then also undermining my ability to work to my potential. In terms of frequencies, like how much is this happening? Here's one graph from our study. It's about 25, so you can see overwhelmingly majority of the population, even if they indicated that they believe climate change is real and a concern, they're not saying it's impacting their lives. And so this also tells us that, hey, this kind of level of functional impairment that we're finding, people saying often to almost always, or less than often or sometimes, that's a hallmark of a disorder. It's a small portion of the population that is experiencing something to this degree. And so the key points from our research here, in terms of what was known previously, the climate change is occurring and it's affecting the health of humans and other organisms. You may have seen in the public press, some people's health is compromised because of this, particularly people who are immunocompromised, like individuals with asthma, for example. There are also populations that are resorting to migration because of climate change. What our study's showing is that beyond those physical impacts of climate change on humans, we don't have clear cutoff points at this moment, but around 25% of our sample is reporting that climate change makes it difficult for them to function in their world. So around 20 to 25% of our sample is saying that they are experiencing functional impairment because of climate change. So our study is the first to show that clinical impairment linked to the way in which people consume information and think about climate change. And if you're asking yourself, like, well, how do you know that's real functional impairment? In terms of scientifically, we took known measures of functional impairment that have nothing to do with the environment, and people who were scored highly on the measure that we developed also scored highly on that functional impairment. And statistically, we were able to take away any influence of other disorders to really isolate it to this climate change phenomenon. So that's a summary of kind of where this research is. This is very new. We just published an article on it. Over the next couple years, we plan to continue developing this with clinical samples, as well as see how these ideas or how climate change anxiety can develop and manifest. So that's an overview of the area. I would love to pause a little bit and see if there's questions you can ask, you can chat. I'll leave it to Sharon to kind of manage some of that mute function and whatnot. And before even that, I just want to say thanks for joining us remotely. Again, I'm so sorry that we aren't in person, but it means a lot to me that you're so interested in the college and in this area of work. So thanks so much.